Hello, everyone. Welcome along to the stream. I'm just propping you up on a textbook to raise you up a bit, so I can see you a bit better. I hope you can hear me okay out there. It's great to see that we've already got some questions in the stream chat channel. That is fantastic. I've certainly received a lot of questions via email. I should turn my phone off, shouldn't I? And we've got some questions in the discussion board thread in the LMS. So let's jump straight in and start working through these questions in turn. We've got a lot to get through. Okay, so I'm going to start with Eva's question here. How specific do we need to be in our participant selection? Should we be narrow in terms of recruiting from a specific gender, age, and or occupation? Eva, that entirely depends on the type of question that you are addressing and the type of research design that you are proposing to address that question. So if you are, for example, taking an experimental approach, maybe, which is really, you'd recall, focused on answering those types of cause and effect questions, and takes an approach that has an emphasis on very tight experimental controls, then you might want to include much more stringent inclusion and exclusion criteria there. But if you were taking maybe a correlational design to answer a relationship type question, you wouldn't be so concerned, maybe, and you might take a less restrictive approach. And Roy follows on from Eva and says, oh, okay, so I think I've just answered your question there, Roy. So you're doing a correlational study. Do I need to narrow the selection of the participants at all? Again, not as much as you would with an experimental design, but having said that, it depends on the framing of your question. So you might be interested in looking at a certain issue in a certain population, for example, and if that was the case, then you would define your, or you would, I suppose, design your sampling technique around your definition of the question, your framing of the research question. So it all depends on specifically what you're proposing in terms of your study. Some of the questions could lend themselves to, I suppose, a more narrow approach, but generally speaking, it's relatively laxed for a study that's looking at establishing an answer to a question of association of a relationship rather than that cause and effect type question. Hi, Jay. So JC asks, concerned that my introduction is too detailed as background information on the topic and a little bit of research necessary. To start with your second, or your question, no. So background research is not necessary. I've really set this assignment up so that you don't necessarily have to consult previous literature at all. So if you feel like your introduction is too detailed, and I can imagine how that would easily be the case given that you've only got 500 words to work with for this assignment. It's not much space at all. So this will be one of the cases where I suggest you want to be very concise. If you are referring to previous research, I suggest that you should really contain that as much as possible. and focus on creative and very applied exploration of the research questions via, let the marking criteria be your guide, essentially, via the tasks that you need to perform. If you are using a standard diagnostic tool, oh, that's interesting. So if you were using a standard diagnostic tool, would it be necessary to include it in an appendix? Necessary? No, but you always could as a matter of practice. You certainly would not get into trouble for including something in an appendix. And really, that can be something to bear in mind, I suppose, as you go on throughout your undergraduate assignments. Is there going to be a problem if I take an inclusive approach and add a little bit of something extra like that in an appendix? If that's not going to be a problem, then you might consider doing it, I suppose. Right, so JC here is asking around the treatment X question for depression. So is depression the construct? Is the treatment the independent variable, and is the outcome the dependent variable? Well, I suppose if I could speak more broadly rather than to the specific question, just for equity's sake, so that I then don't have to go and dissect and comment on the constituent features of every question that people might be addressing. Generally speaking, if we are looking at a treatment trial for any type of illness, or, well, let's keep it constrained to psychology, so some type of psychological disorder or experience of psychological distress, then we would conceive of the whatever that is, whether we would call it anxiety or depression or psychosis or something else. Sure, that would be the construct that we are interested in. We would also be able to conceptualize the treatment at the construct level as well. In terms of independent variables and dependent variables, the independent variable is going to be the treatment, and the dependent variable is going to be the level of disorder. So we would expect that the treatment, the independent variable, is going to manipulate the dependent variable, the level of disorder. In any sort of treatment trial, that's just a general approach. Okay, that scroll got out of hand. Where did we go to? Okay, Sarah's got a question and is wondering, if participants are selected to have a trait, would that be considered an experiment, a quasi-experimental design? Yeah, so quasi-experimental designs are typically designs where participants are allocated to groups on the basis of a trait or a characteristic that is of interest to the research as an independent variable, essentially. So taking an example from my previous research, I have commonly allocated people to groups on the basis of having a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder or not, when I've theorized that whatever it is I was going to measure across those groups would be influenced by the presence of the psychotic disorder or not. So in that respect, I was conceptualizing having a psychotic disorder as being the independent variable, and whatever I was measuring, whether it was some element of memory or visual processing or auditory processing or social cognition or a range of other things, these were dependent variables that I theorized would be affected by the presence of disorder. And the way to get at that, or one way to get at that, is through Allocating people to different groups. So disorder versus no disorder, for example, groups where you can compare scores on some measure of that dependent variable that you're interested in as a function of the groups. Wow, it's a nice day outside. There's not a cloud in the sky. What is going on? We've just had hideous weather and it is beautiful blue sky. I digress, but I'm presented with quite a pretty scene out the window. So a quasi-experimental design is still trying to get at that idea of cause and effect, right? So in that example that I just gave you there, I'm hoping to provide some commentary on this idea that there's something about the psychotic disorder that might involve deficits on, say, hearing task, for example. And by comparing a group of people with a psychotic disorder and people without a psychotic disorder and having a look at their average scores on a hearing test, I might be able to make some inferences about that. But I'm limited in my ability to really draw out those issues of cause and effect because of a range of things, and largely the inability to perform randomized allocation to groups is a barrier there. Very long way to say, Sarah, a long way to say yes to your question. JC, I am sorry that I didn't open the introductory lecture by stating that I am Groot. The backstory is I was oblivious to Guardians of the Galaxy for about 6 months. I did not see it at the cinema, and I did not know why lots and lots of students were coming up to me at the time the first movie came out, and they were coming up and saying, "I am Groot," and giggling and running away, and I didn't know what that was all about. But there you go. Now I know. I'll see if I can work it into my repertoire somewhere, JC. Taylor, do we need to use the Melbourne Psychological Association cover page? No, you do not. You can if you want to. I didn't even know it existed, to tell you the truth. What you're looking for in the preliminary matter in the cover page of your work is obviously your name, your student ID. So we definitely obviously want to be able to allocate you with the grade, the mark that you deserve. And if you don't have a name on your paper, and if you don't have your student ID number on your paper, that might not happen. So make sure you put your identifying information on the assignment, and that will be great. It will really help your marker work out who they're allocating their marks to very simply. And you want to have the standard sort of bit about, this is assignment 1, and you also want to point out that you have not exceeded the word limit there. So that's going to be a critical question, not challenge, not exceeding the word limit here or for any mind-brain behavior one or other assignment. So Phoebe asks if I'm doing a question with an IV and a DV, and the IV is a group, is that quasi or experimental? Okay, so I think I've answered this question, right? So when we create groups that are based on a manipulation of our independent variable by allocating people to groups based on whatever inherent characteristic it is that they already have. So again, whether it was having a psychotic disorder or not, if you've got this situation where you are interested in that inherent natural difference in people, and you use that natural difference to allocate them to groups, then we're talking about a quasi-experimental design. if you're talking about a situation where you take a group of people and then you randomly allocate them to, say, receive a treatment or not, then that is probably going to be closer to an experimental design. And remember, there's all sorts of other controls that would include in an experimental design as well, and a and a quasi-experimental design. Random allocation can be your way of disambiguating those two, I suppose. If you find yourself in a situation where you have got some tight controls, you're wanting to answer a cause and effect question, and you've got random allocation, you probably have an experimental design. If you don't have random allocation to groups, you've probably got a quasi-experimental design, and particularly if the factor that has influenced which group people end up in is actually related to your independent variable. Should our title be the same as our research question? That would be fine, Phoebe. So certainly if you, or somewhere in the very early stages of your assignment, you want to make it very clear to your reader what question you're responding to. Adeline asks, do I need to have some subheadings dividing the intro variables, or try to make one big flowing essay? Excellent question, Adeline. I would suggest that you shouldn't try to make a big flowing essay. That won't work. You've been given a number of discrete tasks, so I suggest creating different sections with different subheadings to address each one of those tasks separately. And Tom says in all caps, Tom's shouting at us, do I have to define what an independent and dependent variable is? I would suggest that you would want to do that for your research if your research has independent and dependent variables involved. It may not. This ties into a question that I've received a couple of times via email, and I've also noticed on the discussion board, and that is, are there independent variables and dependent variables in correlational research? And there are various schools of thought on this. For the purposes of what we're doing here, and what most people would say is, no, there's not. We're just talking about a relationship. We're not inferring that one variable is influencing the other. So there's not an independent and dependent nature to the relationship that's being theorized and tested in a specific research project. In a correlational research project, we're thinking about an association. That's the core of the question. Are these two things related? And if they are, wonderful. Then you might go on and do subsequent research projects that theorize about the nature of the relationship in terms of its direction, and then investigate that. And then those research projects might have an independent variable and a dependent variable. But if you're just interested in correlation, then we're talking about no IV and DV. Human asks if we obtain, for example, happiness scores for every month for a 6-month period and decide to calculate the average for one person, would this be a ratio scale? Oh, that is a very interesting question. I would suggest that it's either a ratio or an interval scale, depending on how you set it up. It would depend on the response scale that you provided and how you collected the data, what the options for responses were. I would suggest that it would probably be more of an interval scale than a ratio scale. It's probably very unlikely that you're going to have 0 moments of happiness over 6 months. And again, it all depends on how you set the measure up with its response items. If a research question, Carla asks here, if a research question is a different question, differences between arts and science students, do we hypothesize that there will be a difference, or we predict that one would be greater than the other? I suppose there's two ways in which you could do this. So we're talking about, are we just saying there's going to be some sort of difference, or are we saying that there will be a direction in this difference, is what you're asking. So what I would suggest here is that if you're going to be thinking that two things are different, you'll probably have, once you go through the process of considering the question and considering what might influence a difference, and you'll get a feeling, or you'll get an idea about how that might play out. You'll pose an idea, a rationale for how that might play out in terms of one group being more of something than another, and you would typically suggest a direction. Wow. Look at all these questions. This is great. Roy Smith asks, the guide for awarding grades doesn't seem to apply to this essay. They are, so what you, I suppose, can take from those broader types of, that's like I know what you're talking about, Roy. So it's the secondary set of general criteria that apply to generally all of the assignments that we have in undergraduate psychology, and they apply more or less, but the idea is to help, I suppose, contextualize and disambiguate the mark and the comments, the feedback that you'll get back from your marker, and to help you understand, given it's more than likely your first time being marked in an undergraduate stream, how it is that you might end up at an H3 or an H2B or an H2A or an H1. What are the types of quality, I suppose, the characteristic qualities of work that we see in each one of those areas? That second set of criteria that are more general and less specific, and have been provided in addition to the more bespoke criteria that just intended to give you some additional context with which to interpret your mark. So I hope that makes sense. So the workplace stress. Okay. So we've got a question here from Niam. I think that is how I pronounce your name. I'm sorry if that's not right. The workplace stress and fatigue question seems like a correlational research question. However, we're not attempting to explain cause and effect. Can I clarify that? Well, that is the thing with correlational research, isn't it? We're not intending to answer cause and effect. We're intending to establish an association. So that sounds right. I think we're on the same page there. Does your name and student ID count towards the word count? That would be really inequitable if we had people with very long names and other people with short names who could get away with a few more words. So no, Carla, we don't include your name, your student ID, things in figures and reference lists and appendices. There's a whole range of things that we don't count when we calculate the word count. Now, this is a good opportunity to discuss this and a good opportunity for you to go to the subject information section of the LMS, and I'm just going there myself, and you will find the word count policy, not in the Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1 manual, but below the Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1 manual, you'll see two manuals. They're basically the same, but they're slightly different versions for undergraduate students and for graduate diploma students. If you're an undergraduate student, select the undergraduate student manual and resources, years 1 to 3, that's what you want. And if you're a graduate diploma student, take the graduate diploma manual and look at the word count policy in there. All of the more general policies you would need to know about are in those more general student manuals. So extension policies and late submission policies and penalty policies and in this case, word count policies are in there. So do be sure to go and have a look at that. Will subheadings count? Yes. Olivia asks, how much detail should I put in your introduction? This is one of those how long is a piece of string questions. I have to be necessarily sort of vague, I suppose, in my answer to these. How much detail should I include? Questions, and I know that's frustrating, but here's the thing. What you want to do is include enough detail, sufficient detail to clarify what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. You want to establish, I suppose, a clear rationale for what, if you can clearly say what you're doing, the reason for why you're doing it, so that your marker understands your action and your reason for your action. I think that's really what you want. Ultimately, what you need to do is test your assignment. So when you write your assignment out, get the marking criteria and mark yourself. This is a really great way to play devil's advocate. You know, devil's advocate, this idea that you take the opposite position to your assignment and you say, what if, you know, this was wrong? And you really take a critical approach to reviewing your own assignment and see if you can pick out problems and pick out issues. This is a great way to strengthen your assignment. So with that in mind, we've got 2 days until the assignment's due, or not even, it's 8 a.m. on Friday, isn't it? So what I'd suggest is that by midday tomorrow, you want to have your assignment written so that you can then step away for an hour or two and then come back and really test your assignment. Look at the marking criteria and each individual little bit in those very bespoke marking criteria in particular, and think, have I done this? Have I done, you know, each task as it's been laid out? Now, let me just pull up this document here. So, you know, if we look at the marking criteria, I've just pulled it up. This is on page 3 of the assignment brief. So the more bespoke criteria that come first, not those second general ones for guidelines for awarding grades generally. But let's look at the introductory statement. So it has your introductory statement, your introductory section for your assignment. Clearly described the chosen question. Has it established the importance of the topic? So why would it be important to investigate this topic? And has it provided a clear and an accurate definition for important terms? So what are the important terms? Have you defined those terms at the point of their introduction? Is the hypothesis related to the research question? Really test that. Is your hypothesis really coming out of that research question? Does it represent it accurately? And is that hypothesis distilled? Is it quite narrow? Is it specific? Is it predicting, remember, an effect? Not predicting that you're not going to find something. We don't do that. So we don't predict a null hypothesis. We're always predicting an effect. There will be a relationship. There will be a difference. There will be something. Is it phrased clearly? Is it phrased accurately? You can ask a friend or a family member to read your hypothesis and then tell you what they think it means. And if they come up with something different to what you had intended, then that's a great way to identify an issue. And maybe you might want to look at wording. Somebody asked up in the up further in the chat, and I can't really remember who it was. Might it be Roy? Was asking about what do you really need to do to get an H1. I'd say this process is a great way to ensure that you're getting high marks, whatever the assignment is. Whenever you get an assignment brief, and next week you'll get another assignment for Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1. So you'll just have submitted this one. And then actually on Friday, we've got the assignment information for assignment 2 going live on the LMS. And we'll let you know about that when it goes live after you've submitted this one. And in that brief, there is a description about what to do. And if you read that description, I would read it with a highlighter and highlight the really important tasks. What are the instructions I'm being given? What am I being asked to do? And then look at the marking criteria. What are the things that I'm going to be assessed on? I need to respond to each one of these things. So when I've written my assignment, take some time away so you've got some time and space. My general way of working with undergraduate stuff was to leave myself at least 3 days. Now, I know we're too late here, but I used to like leaving myself 3 days to get space and time away from the document that I was writing, because you know this, when you are writing something, and you're there in the moment and you're writing it and you think, oh my God, this is the most brilliant thing that anyone's ever written, ever. And then you walk away and you come back to it 2 days later and you go, oh, this is not as great as I thought it was. And you can see the issues. Time and distance really helps with the editorial and the review process. So always try and factor in time to be able to come back, review, really interrogate your work up against the marking criteria and systematically go through, have I addressed criteria 1? Have I addressed criterion 2? And so forth. That review, in my opinion, is the process that will lead to much higher marks than if you just did what a lot of people do, which is write the assignment at the last minute and put it in. You don't have an opportunity then to really vet your assignment, to take time and space to get clarity and to review it with fresh eyes. So certainly by all means, my advice is use the marking criteria. That's what they're there for. Back in my day, we didn't have marking criteria, not that were made available to students. So when I went through university, we were given the assignment brief, the topic. And look, I'm going to be honest, I don't really like marking criteria. I think my personal opinion, which is at odds with the popular way of going about things, is that a part of the process of learning, I think, at a tertiary level is being given a brief, and then part of your process being dissecting that brief, working out what the really important constituent features of the brief are that you need to respond to, making that decision, using your judgment, and then running with that, owning that decision and doing that assignment. I think that's a lost skill now. The marking criteria really provide quite a bit of hand-holding, which is fine. I mean, it just leads to better marks, but I think there's something to be said for having to navigate uncertainty a little bit more. So anyway, that's my own little rambling. Okay, we've got lots of questions, so I'm going to keep coming through as quickly as I can. Shortcomings of research isn't mentioned in marking criteria. You can certainly briefly acknowledge the limitations of your research if you would like to. Roy, it's generally something we wouldn't do necessarily in a proposal as much as we would actually in the write-up of the research to come. Generally, your proposal and the people reviewing your proposals would be doing so with their expert knowledge around the limitations of the particular approach that you're taking. You can certainly contextualize your approach and be specific about what it can tell you about the question, and maybe that's sort of the mirror image of what you're proposing there. That might be a way to go about it. When we're reporting the research for more mass consumption, then we'd take maybe a more contextualized, not necessarily more transparent, but certainly transparency is always what we want to do, but a more contextualized approach for people who maybe don't have the same degree of expertise. Timothy asks, can rating scales such as Likert scales be seen as an interval scale rather than an ordinal scale? It's an interesting and ongoing area of debate, Timothy. The conservatives amongst us, including myself, will quite commonly conceptualize Likert scales or Likert scales as ordinal more so than interval. There are ways to construct interval scales and responses such that they could arguably represent an interval scale more than an ordinal scale to a point. We're dealing in shades of gray here, but importantly, again, this highlights the value of transparency. So if you're transparent in your reporting and you report that you've done this data analysis and you've done this data analysis based on either an interval or an ordinal conceptualization of your Likert scale, then your reader can interpret your findings and your conclusions with that context. And they can make up they can read your piece of work critically and make up their mind based on their knowledge of methodology and what that exactly means regarding your conclusions and so forth. Sophie asks if she can combine measurement and research design into one group, given I am using a non-experimental design, my measurement and research design into one group. I'm wondering if you're asking if you could present it in one section of your report. I would typically, I think it would be better to go through the process of reporting on measurement first and then research design. So this comes back to that structure of the assignment question, doesn't it? How do we structure this assignment? I think it would be best to have those 5 sections. So your introductory statement, your hypothesis, the variables discussion, the measurement discussion, the research design discussion. I think if you can present those discreetly and clearly, then you're just leading your researcher directly to consider each bit that you've done separately and highlighting that you have indeed done each bit. Lena, okay, so that's a really good question. How do we establish the importance of a research topic? It's easier for some um, um, topics on the face of things more than others. What you need to ask yourself is, why is this an interesting or a useful or a valuable thing to know about? Why would we want to know about this? What could be the output of this research? So, what might we find? And then, what might that inform? For example, is there a pragmatic thing that might inform? Could there be some improvement for people that occurs, some policy development, some new service, for example? Or might this lead to a subsequent research project that might have value in such in a certain way or another? It's thinking about value. It's thinking about the contributions that this research could make to the field, and maybe in terms of addressing an unanswered question, innovating some methodology, clinical implications, pragmatic implications for people or systems, um, or just for the value of pursuing knowledge as well. There's a few different ways in which you could think about the importance of your research. Each one of them are not too obscure that I think you'd be able to come up with something with not too much difficulty. And we're not expecting you to come up with something that no one ever will have thought of. It's not going to be the case that you need to come up with some, incredibly unique and original selling point that no one will have ever thought of, because some of the you want to deal with the obvious things as well. Ticking the boxes. This comes back to what I was saying, I suppose, about the marking criteria and that question about what does it take to get an H1, this mysterious H1. What does it take to get one of those? And I'm sure that there's going to be, all I know, statistically speaking, is going to be a lot of people who get one of those for this assignment. And there's a couple of ways in which you can go about getting an H1, and it depends on the type of assignment. For this assignment, really, we're talking about creativity, but we're also talking about ticking those criteria boxes. If you can do that with any assignment, make sure you address each criterion clinically and systematically. It doesn't matter how many bells and whistles you build in. If you tick the boxes for marking criteria, you're going to get a good mark. Bells and whistles are great, but only if you're actually doing all of that foundational stuff, all the stuff that you need to do. Thankfully, we're addressing a lot of the questions that I've been emailed as well, and that are on the discussion board. So this is good. Mitchell asks, are we supposed to state the construct as a dependent variable and then proceed to operationalize the construct in another section, or is the DV the actual measurement? So when we're talking about when we're talking about constructs and variables, we're generally talking at two different levels, aren't we? We're talking about this abstract level, and then we're talking at that operationalized level as well. Oh, I've answered that one already. Why should people care or pay attention to my research? Can you just make something up? Yes, we all do all the time. this is what creativity is. Creativity is a better way to phrase, I think, making something up. So generally, you will think about the good that your research might do for people, what it might lead to, and it doesn't have to, again, be direct. So in terms of the importance of the research that I do, for example, I would say half of the stuff that I do actually will translate into direct positive outcomes, particularly for people with psychological disorders. The other half of the research that I do will not directly translate into positive outcomes for people, but will inform new research that will then hopefully have that output of translation into positive outcomes for people. So one of the ways in which you might think about your research is it going to inform future research that could be built upon to create some sort of good? Is it a necessary stepping stone, for example? Oh, where am I up to in this chat window? This is so great, guys. Thank you so much for participating in this stream. I really appreciate it. It's so great to have questions in the chat window. Roy, yep. So regarding word count again, I'll refer everybody, and this is a good reminder for those of you who have just joined us. For the word count policy, please refer to the subject information section of the LMS and to the years 1 to 3 or graduate diploma word count policy, and you will find it in the manual. And the manual, I'm just looking at it now, it's got everything you would possibly want to know. And we have talked about word count. We haven't actually talked about word penalties, word count penalties. There are penalties for exceeding the word limit, and it's pretty hefty. You definitely want to avoid getting a penalty for exceeding a word limit. So, you can read this on page 17 of the undergraduate student manual, but if you exceed the word limit by 10% or more, then there's actually a 10% penalty for every 10% that you're over. So if the assignment, I'll read this actually from the manual here. So for example, for an assessment with a specified word limit of 1,000 words marked out of 100, there would be no penalty for assignments with a word count up to 1,099 words. That's because that's just under 10%, right? But what would be 10% over? 1,100. So a penalty of 10 marks or 10% of the assignment score would be applied to assignments with a word count between 1,100 and 1,199 words. A penalty of 20% or 20 marks would be applied to assignments with a word count between 1,200 and 1,299 words, etc. And that's for a 1,000 word assignment. I hate this. Here we go, me being all old school again, but I don't like the 10% over leeway. Personally, I think it's bad training. So just today, a new opportunity landed on my desk that I'm going to write an application for about research. I'm going to write a proposal, very much like what you guys are writing for assignment 1. I'm going to do that this afternoon. It's going to be my task for the day this afternoon. And that proposal has got 0% leeway in terms of the word count. The word count, 5,000 words, is the word count. That's it. And this is the way real academic work um, works for proposals, for publications. There's word counts. The word counts are set, they're firm. Therefore, even though you technically have this up to, but not actually 10% over leeway, built into the subject manual and the word count policy, and again, review that for yourself, I encourage you to write to the prescribed word count, which for this assignment is 500 words. And I think that is good professional development. And that's what you're here doing, right? You're here having the opportunity to focus on developing your professional skills and knowledge before you go and do whatever is next after undergraduate study. So why not do yourself that favor and learn to acquire that skill? It can be something you're proud of. So I hope that answers your question there, Jazz, as well. So Human asks, can you abbreviate things like, so if we abbreviated auditory verbal hallucinations to AVH? Yes, you can, as long as you do that at its first point of introduction, and then you use that abbreviation consistently throughout. Doing a correlational study, what important terms are there to be defined? Oh, well, that all depends on your question. I suppose you'd be thinking about the constructs for your study and what you might need to define around those. Never apologize for questions, Olivia. Questions are always welcome. That's what we're here for. This is the point of university. Is there a specific way you should set out the paper? Okay, good question. Like around formatting. Yes. Again, refer to that student manual that I've been talking about, and it will have some general guidelines for formatting your paper. Double spacing would be wonderful, please. If you can double space, that would be excellent. Yes, page numbering, all of those sorts of things, all of those guidelines are in that subject manual. Felicity asks if, for the stress and fatigue question, the worst workplace stress and fatigue question, would it be appropriate or okay to narrow it down to a specific workplace or keep it general? I will leave it up to you. You can do either. That will be completely fine. So then you have a second question about, will that mean that our hypothesis won't reflect the research question well enough? I suppose that's something you'll need to keep in mind. And so you could always try and narrow it down to a specific workplace and then ask yourself if that still is congruent with the research question, if you still think everything is gelling well across those levels of hypothesis and research question. And if your answer is yes, it appears to be fine, then good. Roy asks, I feel that I need to introduce variables and measurement before stating the hypothesis. Again, if you I put things in discrete sections such that your marker knows what it is that you're doing, that's fine. The order, I suppose, is, well, everything's ultimately up to you. So you do what you feel you need to do, what you think is best. Maya asks, for the treatment X question, do you design the research just generally? Oh, I've lost us. Where is this window? Just generally for any depression treatment, or do we have to specify whether it's a therapy or a medication treatment? I suppose you could do it either way. You could either be non-specific or you could be specific. My intuition is that it might be more interesting and easier for you to write if you were more specific in that instance. Um, Are survey responses, okay, so a good question here from Sophie. Are survey responses considered a discrete variable or a straight variable? Ooh. Based on an ordinal scale, so a continuous variable. If we are talking about a discrete variable or a straight variable, um, what are we asking here? So it depends on the nature of the scale that you are using. Um, it depends on the nature of the scale that you're using. I'm just trying to think. Just bear with me 1 second while I do just a little bit of digging. So you've had tutorial one. I wouldn't get too hung up on this. So what you'll just need to think about, I suppose, to help you maybe disambiguate whether you're dealing with a discrete or a continuous variable would be to think about, would it make sense to talk about whatever the thing that you're measuring is in terms of fractional numbers? Would it make sense to talk, for example, in terms of 1.5 people? And would it make sense to create an average from it? If it wouldn't make sense to create an average of an aggregated response, and if it doesn't make sense to talk about things in terms of fractions, then you're probably talking about a discrete variable. But if it does make sense, then you'd probably be talking about a continuous variable. Now, let me pull up my notes here. So I've got a bunch of emails that I've received, and I just want to make sure that I'm addressing all of the questions that I've been emailed as well as the chat. So I think we're through the chat now, but I'll check in again in a moment. Okay, we've answered whether or not there are independent and dependent variables in correlational designs. Oh, okay. So here's a really good question. So this question actually comes out of the marking criteria. And I've got a question here from a student who has been wondering about whether or not they need to make the hypothesis very, very long so that it has an equal number of words as the other four sections that you need to address, the other four areas um, of the essay. So, no. The other question there was, should the hypothesis be a single sentence? And the answer to that would be yes. So we want the hypothesis to be a brief statement that's a single sentence that makes a prediction about what's going to happen in the research. We want that to be quite contained. Okay, so JC's asked a question here. We don't need to review previous literature in the introduction. Am I just saying this is the construct, this is my treatment or drug, and this is what I'm investigating? I suppose that's a very simple way of saying it. Again, using those marking criteria, just making sure you're addressing each one of the constituent features of the marking criteria, and you'll be golden. Okay. Now, I did just receive another email, and I saw it was about the assignment, so let me refresh my inbox here. Oh, here it is. Okay, so here's a really good question. I have an assignment question about variables. This is from Chloe. Is the level of something, so for example, the level of workplace stress, a continuous variable or a discrete variable? Well, that would be all about how we collect the data and what the response options are. So that would, again, we could apply that test of, does this make sense to speak in terms of fractions? And would it make sense to, at an aggregate level, speak in terms of an average? And if it does, then we're probably talking about a continuous variable. If it doesn't, we're probably talking about a discrete variable. All right, so I'm just going to have a look in the discussion board really quickly again and see if there are questions that we haven't addressed just yet. I've seen two people post this morning about problems with Turnitin submission and finding that their submission was timing out. So I've done I can run a little report in the back end of the LMS, which will tell me if there's any problems with the various plugins, including Turnitin. There's been no reported problems with Turnitin. Everything points to it functioning correctly, and I can see that hundreds of people have already submitted their assignments without issue. So if you're having a timeout problem, I'd suggest it's probably more about the connection that you're using, or it could be something about the document. So if you have created a particularly large document, that might be a problem. I would suggest that if you're putting images in, you want to make those images, reasonably small. If you've included images of something in an appendix, for example, that should get around the problem. But if somebody's already trying to submit, that's great. You've got plenty of time to work through those connection issues. And actually, this highlights such a great thing to be mindful of for your first assignment here at university. Definitely do not leave this until 7:55 on Friday morning to try and submit, because you know what the NBN and what the internet is like. It conspires against us. And Murphy's Law certainly applies with the internet. That's, if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. So definitely be submitting by the end of Thursday. Get it done. Don't leave time to fall victim to internet outages and whatnot just before you're submitting, because The reason I say this is because, again, I'll reference that manual. The allowances around late submissions and technical difficulties are completely strict and unforgiving. Um, you know, I'll quote here, you know, if there's computer failure, software malfunction, disk failures, printing difficulties, other unavoidable, you know, aspects of computer use that should be anticipated and planned for. The internet is a good one to plan for. These sorts of things don't result in assignment, in extensions and so forth. So make sure you don't have a late penalty applied. Get things in good time. Now I've got a couple of exam related questions to finish up with. I've received a handful of emails over the last couple of days asking about when the final exam is, and I've said this before, but just to reiterate, I don't know. I find out at the same time as you find out, and that's in mid-May. We'll all know. I won't be able to provide any advice up until that point, and you'll know at exactly the same point that I do. As people have been asking me about what dates the exam has fallen on in previous years, and I certainly understand and certainly empathize around wanting to book travel at the end of semester. But the plain and simple story is that the exam date is highly variable. It changes each year and each semester. As students, we, or you now, are expected to make yourself available for examination for the entire examination period. I've received a couple of these questions. I can't give you an earlier or a later exam if you're going on holidays. That is just not a thing. So, yeah, unfortunately, I'm sorry, I can't give more details about the exam date at this point. Another question has been about the exam itself, the questions in the exam, whether there's previous exams to study, and how do I know what the exam questions will be like, and how do I study for them? We'll talk about this more in due course, but just to answer those questions very briefly right now, we know there's going to be 120 questions, and that's 30 questions from each lecturer's content. So there'll be 30 for me from research methods, 30 from Jason for behavioral neuroscience, 30 from Simon, and 30 from Meredith for learning and cognition. If you think about the number of lectures there, that means that there's around 10 to 12 lectures for each of those people. There's going to be about 10, sorry, that's a lie. There's going to be about 3 questions, roughly, coming from each lecture. That's the average amount that you could expect, right? So my advice would be to, when you sit a lecture, as you go through the lecture and prepare to study for it, pick out what are the 3 or 4 most important things, and they are prime candidates to be examined. That makes sense. If you've got a limited number of questions, you're probably going to be, for the most part, asking about some important things, not things that you murmured as you walked off stage. So pick out the important things, and that will help guide your study. Start with those and then drill down into more detail as you've got time. There are no previous psychology exams available for study. That's not the way we do things in the school. But there are practice questions, of course. I've given you practice quizzes for the online modules, and those quizzes will give you a very good idea of the flavor of the question. the flavor of the questions. So I hope that makes sense. Um, those practice questions essentially model what the final exam questions will be like, the types of things I might ask. There may be questions that are tapping the same topic. There probably will be, right? If I've given you feedback questions that are asking about important topics, there's probably going to be exam questions that ask about those same topics, but ask about it in a different way. So certainly do the review questions. Jason's questions will also not be exam questions, but will give you a flavor of what to expect for the exam. There is one anomaly here, and it is the good Dr. Cropper, Simon Cropper, who's going to be taking you for sensation and perception very shortly, is actually, drum roll, going to give you his exam questions. What? But he's not going to give you the answers. So this means that you'll have the questions. You'll have to try and learn or find out what the answers to those questions will be. And he'll put those, or some of, so he'll give you a set of, I'm trying to remember, I think it's like 50 or 60 questions, and a subset of those will be on the exam. And you'll have to work out what they are. That sounds great on the face of things, but if you think about it, that's actually quite difficult, because in a multiple choice question scenario, you'll have 4 options, 4 alternative answers provided to you, and they really disambiguate what the question's about a lot of the time. You won't have that context, so you really have to be on your toes and use Simon's questions as he goes through his lecture series. And if I was you, I'd have his questions ready, and I'd be there, you know, at lectures with a pen and paper, waiting to write down the answers to questions as he went through and really understand what's going on. Okay, so, oh, wow, we've been going for a while. Okay, so speaking of that proposal that I need to write, I'm going to have to go and write that proposal. So we've been on for nearly an hour and a quarter. I hope that's answered most of, oh, we've got another couple of questions here. Let me just finish up with those really quickly. Is it necessary to include ethical considerations in this assignment? Not necessarily, not necessary for this assignment. Hopefully you would think about that in the construction of your research question, your research project, I should say, but you don't need to explicitly address that in this assignment. I think that's a really interesting question, and maybe that's something that we might build in for a future assignment, but not this one. Sebastian asks, if I refer to a type of measurement for fatigue, do I need to outline the entire measuring process, or just the research that measurement type to know enough what scale it is? You could do both there, Sebastian. So commonly people will talk about how the process for participants completing the data collection. You could certainly talk about that if you wanted to. And Lena says, I'm sorry, I have to ask again. That's okay. No need to be sorry. I'm doing the workplace stress and fatigue question. So for 1C, let me have a look at the document. 1C. Oh, 1C. Okay, so providing definitions for important terms, I presume we're talking about here. Would that be defining workplace stress and fatigue? Yeah, exactly what I meant. Talking about those constructs, defining those constructs. And if there's anything else that is unique, a unique term that you use in your proposal, yes, you define them as well. So yes, definitely on the right track there, Lena. Okay, so Caitlin is still checking through the discussion board, which is really great. I hope you've found this helpful. I think we got through a lot of questions there. Um, and don't stress about this. The whole point of this assessment is really just to get you to start thinking about the content, and to get a little bit of some marks on the board, so to speak, some runs on the board, and to um, uh, go through that process of rehearsing a really important practical skill for psychology, which is proposal writing. And again, case in point, as soon as we finish the stream, I'll be writing a proposal this afternoon, which will very largely mirror what you guys are doing in this assignment. So, that's an interesting idea. Maybe at some point you might be interested in seeing a real proposal, for some sort of, maybe an ethics proposal. You might want to see a real one of those. And I can certainly arrange to share one of those with you in due course. So I think that's it for now. Thanks, everyone. I hope you found this useful, and I will speak with you again soon. Certainly next week we will catch up and we'll talk about where to from here, now that assignment 1 is all done and dusted and you're breathing a sigh of relief. Okay, everyone, good luck with the assignment, and I will speak with you next week. Take care.